Pemaquid Communications, innovative, accessible web design and development from offices in Portland, Maine. On the web at pemaquid.com.
Welcome. This is our Afterthoughts segment where we keep our guests around from our broadcast show for some extended conversation and hopefully some even more candid observations. Today we have Martin Grimnes, the President of Harbor Technologies, and more importantly, the 2011 Business Leader of the Year for the Small Business category for Mainebiz. Thanks for sticking around, and congratulations again. I want to follow up on some of the things we talked about. And I want to jump back real quickly about how you made the decision to you invested in new equipment and new machinery, too, when you went into Harbor Technologies to be able to make the new components that you're talking about. And it was a departure. What is it called? The pultrusion machine? Tell me about that, how you decided to do that. It couldn't have been cheap.
If we're to succeed in the state of Maine in the manufacturing business, we need to take or benefit or take advantage of technology. We know painfully well that we're not going to compete against China in terms of cost of labor.
Right.
So how do you combat that? And the only way to do that is through automated processes and mechanical processes, in my opinion. Raw materials are not that drastically different from what they pay in China. So if we can compete on the technological level, and that is the key, you have to. So you mentioned this investment we made in this process equipment. It is a continuous process, basically a spaghetti or noodle machine.
It's cool.
Where you feed in all the fibers and you feed in all the resin, and out comes the finished product. And a very complex process, but it requires maybe a person and a half or two people to run that piece of equipment. That today competes with doing the same by hand is probably 10 people.
Right. Right. So the investment in the equipment would pay off in the long term and keeping your labor costs down and being able to produce a product that you couldn't have done otherwise, really, especially the bigger pieces. Yeah. Okay. I want to ask you, too, about, it was also noted in the article that you're exploring a joint venture to set up production in South Korea, tapping into a global market for composite infrastructure projects while maintaining your roots in Maine. So, and you say that seems to be the next logical step. You're quoted as saying, at some point you have to consider doing it elsewhere, especially overseas. How do you talk about that? How do you come to that, make that decision, and how will that impact your productions in Maine?
Number one, dealing in the infrastructure industry, most of what we build is very, very large. As you mentioned earlier, we ship pilings that are 110 feet long. We're shipping now bridge beams to the state of Missouri that are 120 feet long. If you want to address overseas markets, I hate to say it, but deck cargo is very cumbersome, and you need to be local with your production. And as we look at markets, whether it's in the Middle East or in the Far East or in Europe or in South America or in Africa for that, we cannot base our competitiveness on producing that in the state of Maine, even though we'd like to. However, we do all the product developments here, and the prototyping and the process developments will be done in Maine. And then we need to find partnerships or do it alone in that local economy.
How do production costs compare there versus here?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, in order for us to be competitive, whether it's here locally or anywhere, I keep saying that one of the keys to success is to base it on a technological advantage. And you got to, if you have a 2-year advantage of your competition, just make sure you maintain that 2 years and make sure
that
they
catch up, you're already the next 2 years old.
Right, and make sure that none of your products gets to be over 5 years old, because then somebody's going to start chasing you on it. So you need to drop the 5-year-old product for some improvement, or 5-year-old product or process. So I think your question was, how did this stack up overseas? As we look towards more and more mechanical processes, the cost of labor plays a less significant role.
Right.
If you have a labor cost that is 10% or less, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, because then it's just you're closer to the source, so the transportation costs are less, and So that's where the benefit is.
With a labor cost of that rate, we can compete pretty much anywhere.
All right. Okay. Two quick questions for you, and we'll close off. They asked you, what are Maine's biggest challenges? And you said, quote, if we don't invest in new technologies that replace labor but remain in old technologies, we're dead. And I think that's what you were just talking about. Are there other industry sectors that you can point to and say, you know, the kind of things we're doing in composites, the new kinds of approaches, that needs to be done in those industry sectors as well for Maine to really... I mean, we've already done it. You know, in pulp and paper, that's clearly, they've been...
Yeah,
they have a much smaller workforce, but they're producing more than ever.
Right. You look at a paper machine, and it's staggering what you can do with a paper machine. And I am no expert on other. I happen to be an expert, maybe in the textile industry, because that's where I came from.
Right.
And we have lost a good portion of that in the U.S. But I'm going to stay. To answer your question on the composite sides, because that's what I know the best. And as I said, the investment in technology, it's an absolute must if we're going to be prosperous here or anywhere.
Okay, good. And then you also talked about the biggest opportunity for Maine is building on viable technological clusters. How do we determine what's viable? I mean, everybody wants to have some cluster out there. Which one do we invest in?
We have a viable cluster in the boat building business.
Right.
You have a Hinkley, you have a Lyman Morris, and you have a Sabre.
It's been around for 300 years, so
right.
I guess it's a viable cluster.
And you know out of those companies you're going to find stupid people like myself who's going to get a bright idea and say, I can do this myself too.
Right.
And all of a sudden you have a startup company.
Yeah. Okay.
So the composites industry has demonstrated in Maine that we are a viable cluster. And especially when you now look at the renewable energy opportunities, you look at the infrastructure opportunities that we're dealing with, and you just have to look very quickly at the benefits that composite brings, whether it's corrosion or it's the aerospace industry, that you can take half the weight out of an aircraft by building it in composites. That cluster is strong, and I do want to stress also what the state of Maine has done. It started with Angus King when they created MTI.
Right.
It was followed up by Baldacci when he got some significant funding for the education of the composites labor force, which the Department of Labor sort of...
was that North Star Alliance grant?
That was a
$15 million grant that came
and
through?
that
really was...
had a huge impact.
Did that have a huge impact? Did it, a lasting impact?
Well, it continues because it stimulated and it brought focus to the need for education of the workforce.
Right.
And that is continuing. As you can see, over half of our employees are involved in an educational program of one sort or another. And that's key to success.
Okay, and I think that's what we're talking about, is investing in it and keeping that there, and the educational part too. Great. Thanks again. Congratulations again. Appreciate you taking the time. Great.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you all.